Welcome, everyone, to the Disrupting Wellbeing podcast. This is an exciting one for me. I love it when I can call on someone I not only work with, but I've seen do their thing and has an incredible story, but also can count as a friend. So welcome, Emily Warren, to the show. It's great to have you. Now, you are the Director and Global Wellbeing Lead for Avanade. That's already a total mouthful, and I know you've been doing it for a little while. You're a specialist in employee experience. You work globally, so there's that cultural element. And then I also noticed you have a degree in physics and astrophysics. I want to talk about other stuff now because my mind is blown. I'm fascinated by this. What got you onto that path is what I want to know.
Well, I think at school we were just encouraged to kind of do what we were best at. And so all the way through, I was really strong at sciences, really strong at maths. So I just kept on picking those things that I was best at. I did really quite love physics when I was a kid. But what I found as I sort of went through A-levels and university was it got more mathematical and less conceptual. And I kind of fell out of love with it a bit. And what struck me looking back is that nobody ever asked me, what do you love doing? What kind of brings you joy? And I think I would have made maybe different choices about what I would have studied if I'd thought about that. But, that's kind of how I got into physics. But I loved, when I was a kid, I really loved just looking at the sky and the enormity of it. And it made me feel kind of insignificant, but in a good way. Like my problems were always smaller because if I was insignificant, then my problems were nothing in the kind of grand scale of the cosmos. So I always found that kind of reassuring. And I was fascinated with how, the planets worked and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's not something I ended up with as a career as a result,
But what a beautiful way to actually get started and get a little bit of perspective, because I think in our workplaces with the well-being agenda and mental health and workplace and evolving the workplaces for the future, and I know you work tirelessly on this topic, as do I, but also to get that perspective of what actually matters in the world, right? How insignificant are we in the grand scheme of things, right? And it does become, yes, it's about the big strategies, but it's also just about the joy, the little human interactions, which I think we're forgetting in these sorts of well-being roles sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I've got about 17,000, 18,000 people I look after. So, on one side, you're kind of thinking, well, what can we do that's big, that's going to affect everybody? And thinking in ways of, can we shift people's employee experience just that little bit? Because if you can improve it a little bit for a lot of people, you can have a massive impact. But then on the other hand, sometimes I have to kind of remind myself that actually at the end of every single story, there's a real person. And one day in the past, that was me. And I still think about that and am incredibly grateful for that, because it was down to one person knowing me, recognizing that I'd asked a question that was out of character and coming to me and saying, are you all right? That sort of really changed the course of my life at that point and ultimately my career afterwards. But so I have to try and, remember sometimes that, there is always a personal story, and you may look at some of these things and go, okay, well, it's one or two people out of 17,000. What difference does that really make? Well, to the person who that is, it can be life-changing. And so I think you've got to be able to have that kind of big perspective and look at, everybody. And think sort of big strategically, but you've also got to be able to think about each individual and what difference you can make in their lives, because it can be profound.
And this is what I've always admired about you from the very beginning of us knowing each other, is that no matter how big your role got, and I know it's global and I want to pick your brain on that a little bit, you have been one of those people that have kept the heart of it, right? You have kept your story has influenced your passion, I guess, to remember the one human at the end, right? Because it's kind of tricky to do that sometimes when you're asked about targets and scale and budgets. And I know some of the things that you've got going on. So what was just a little bit of your story? What led you to being passionate and that one person noticing?
So, we've got to go back to, I think it's 2012. And I was working on a project. So at this time, I was a consultant in the software industry, at the same company that I work for now, but in our consulting working force. I was working away from home. We were working very, very long hours. And I was also moving house. And our house move went really, really wrong in quite a spectacular way. And the house that we were moving into got flooded and we weren't able to move in for various legal reasons. The vendor wasn't liable for it. It wasn't insured. So the house move went very, very wrong. And what should have been a straightforward house move ended up with our house getting flooded. For various legal reasons, our vendor wasn't liable for it. We ended up not being insured for it. They weren't insured for it. Just horrible situation. So we went overnight from being, financially secure and looking towards a new house to being effectively homeless. Our house was unlivable. And, a very, very stressful situation where we were basically just staying in B&Bs or on, friends' houses for the next sort of 3 months as we got our house to a fairly basic state. As we dried it out, we were taking, 60 litres of water out of the house every day in dehumidifiers. So it was just a really stressful period. But I went back to work. And the reason I went back to work, as planned after this aborted house move, was because I felt I had to. The project team was saying, we're relying on you. You need to be here, and I didn't feel that I could take a step back. I'm the main earner. We were in financial trouble. We were financially secure and we'd moved to this house that's now a complete, bomb site. And, we're suffering sort of a big financial shock. And I'm thinking, well, I've got to go back to work. I've got to keep paying for this. And the people on my project, they're all very sympathetic. But, looking back on it, I always blamed myself for my burnout and not sort of saying I need some time. But now I kind of look at it with my sort of more strategic lens on. I'm like, well, where was the opportunity created for me to say something? They all knew what I'd been through. Nobody said, do you think you might need to talk to somebody about that? That sounds really stressful. Or maybe you should take an extra couple of days and make sure that you've got somewhere to live.
Get your basic needs met, right?
I mean, they did, to be fair, they did offer to house us, but up in Warrington, which is no use for, my husband, who's trying to, get our house livable back in Oxford. So, there were things that, the team did right around me at that point, but there's things that I definitely look at in retrospect and think, actually, what can we do differently? So I just carried on, basically. I carried on working, went back to work. But what happened over the next couple of years is my anxiety got worse and worse. And
years, though, that's interesting. Like the build up took a good long time.
So it was about 2 years it took. And, what I'd realized was something can happen out of the blue that you're not even expecting. So my brain was kind of going, okay, well, the worst can happen. So what else is going to go wrong? And I was very aware that I was still away on projects, traveling, and my husband was back here. He'd be up in the roof and, climbing around the loft and all of these things by himself, in not in unsafe circumstances, but certainly in slightly precarious ones. So that kind of just gnawed away at me, I think, for the next couple of years. And I carried on working, long hours in a demanding job. And actually, we weren't married at the time, so we were also planning a wedding. So we'd moved house, we're planning a wedding, and had this demanding job. And we're effectively trying to renovate the house around us as well, because it was, a mess. And in the end, what happened was I was working away in Colchester, and there was actually flooding in Oxford from the River Thames bursting its banks, and a load of houses that got flooded. And it was on the news. So I was sort of stood there just before I was about to go to client site in the morning in my hotel, had the news on in the background while I was getting ready. And this news story came on with this, and they interviewed this lady whose house had just been flooded. And I just started crying and I couldn't stop. And it was the look on her face just kind of connected in something with me. And even though, it for us, it had been an internal flood, not an external flood. So it was a kind of different circumstance. It was this, I could relate to that feeling of that loss of security. And so I cried my way into work and cried my way back to my hotel for about, 2 to 3 weeks, getting increasingly, fraught, struggling to keep that mask on. I was very consciously sat in the car park before I got out of my car at the office going, right, get your game face on. But I think the cracks were starting to show. And I luckily was on a leadership program at the time, and I had an executive coach, and I was in a coaching session with her, and she was like, how's it going? And I started crying and explained to her that I wasn't in a good way, and she said, what do you want to happen? And I said, I just want it to stop. I just want it to stop now. And I was, by this point, the shame was so acute that I wasn't able to cope. And I would think,
so what was the shame? Tell me more about that.
My mental picture of myself was always somebody who was strong. I was always helping other people. I was always very independent. And the, as far as, we're 2 years later at this point, and as far as where I was concerned is, I wasn't coping with, I was working on 4 projects, I was getting married, I was renovating a house, and I wasn't coping with that. And, I spoke to a counsellor sort of shortly after my burnout happened, and I got signed off from work. And she sort of said, that sounds like an awful lot. Any one of those would be a stressor. And I remember replying, but when our house got flooded 2 years ago and we were homeless and I was working 16-hour days, I dealt with that all right. And she just looked at me and she said, and when did you stop and deal with that? And that was the first time I realized that it wasn't just what was going on in that moment. It was everything I've been carrying for the previous 2 years. And I was just really lucky that, I had that coach. She sort of persuaded me that I had to do something. I had to take some action. And the action we agreed on was for me to ask for our sabbatical policy. So I then wrote to our HR team and said, can I have the sabbatical policy? And this is where the personal bit comes in. Because the person who received that email looked at it and thought, that's one of our most enthusiastic and dedicated employees. Better just check that everything's okay.
Something's going on. Yeah.
She just thought, that doesn't quite smell right. Something wrong, not quite right here. I'll just check. And of course, as soon as she got on the phone to me and said, Emily, is everything okay? And that's all it took. By that point, I couldn't, if somebody asked, I couldn't mask it anymore. And I just burst into tears. And she, she was saying, are you okay to work? Thinking, I'd say no. And I'm literally sobbing down the phone to her going, yes, I'm fine. I can keep going. And she, bless her, managed to persuade me to tell a couple of people, my department head. And it kind of...
What do you think you just didn't want to... Was it just habit, or you didn't want to let people down to say, I guess I can still work?
It wasn't habit. It was an acute sense of shame that I was letting people down. The people who were the hardest to tell were the people I respected the most. And it took, so I had the executive coach, I had my HR rep, I had my departmental lead, I had my career advisor. Between them, they kind of shipped me off to the doctor. And only when the doctor signed me off did I kind of go, okay, I'll stop. But I didn't know how. And it took, I think I got worse for the first couple of weeks. And then I kind of said, okay, I'll start taking the antidepressants and the mindfulness training. Oh God, that's a funny one. I just to show where my head was at during all of this. I signed up to a 1-month mindfulness course. And
As you
at
do.
the time, I'd been signed off for 2 weeks. And I think my doctor did that very purposefully. She signed me off a couple of weeks at a time. I think if she signed me off for 2 months from the word go, I'd have had a meltdown about it. But so I'm signed off for 2 weeks. I've got a 1-month mindfulness course I've signed up to. And I'm thinking, well, if I meditate really hard in 2 weeks, can I
Fix
squeeze
it.
my mindfulness course into 2 weeks? Which is like
You're trying to hack mindfulness. Yeah.
crazy when you think about it, isn't it? It's like if I relax really hard, I can squeeze 2 weeks holiday into one. No, of course you can't. But that's just where my head was at. And what was really scary for me as I started kind of appreciating this at the time was, I've built a career out of being able to think about large amounts of information and draw those together and make logical conclusions from lots of disparate pieces of information. And, my logical reasoning is really one of my main skills. And actually, where my brain was at that time, I was going A to B to C to F, to Z, and ending up somewhere completely different. And I realized that I couldn't trust my own thoughts. And that was kind of terrifying.
That's scary, isn't it?
That was where I had to rely on other people and friends and start talking about things, because sometimes it's just vocalizing stuff out loud where you realize that what makes sense in your head.
I just heard myself say that. Yeah.
And it's just nuts. That doesn't make sense at all. But sometimes it was really my friends going, right, so hang on, your company is invested on putting you on this executive leadership course thing. And you think that's because you're a poor performer and need the help, not because you're a strong performer and they want to invest in you. And I was like, yes, I genuinely believe that. That was what I genuinely thought, which is, again, looking back on it, not a sensible conclusion to have drawn.
But what's really interesting from your story, and I think a lot of people can relate to, I can relate to wearing a mask, right? And we wear the masks for months and months, maybe our whole life. We've been wearing some kind of mask in some kind of environment. And these expectations of what strength looks like, right? Like be strong, show up, provide. And then you're in survival mode a lot, which I think a lot of people can relate to as well, right? Because your house is flooded. Like these are your kind of primary kind of needs are being affected in so many ways. And then for you, it wasn't just one person. And I say that because sometimes when we're helping others, we're like, well, what difference will it make for me to say this one thing, right? And you had the coach and then the HR kind of professional person, and it sounds like some friends, and then finally the doctor. And, and you had this kind of almost team that weren't coordinated, but were your concerned kind of boardroom in a way that kind of showed up when you needed them. And so I say that just to highlight, what people think help looks like, right? And they're like, oh, well, why should I say that one thing? But if you hear the same thing 3 times that day or in that week, right? And then you're at the doctor and the authority figure says it, I don't know, you needed all of those people to help you land the messages.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was coordinated because it was the coach that made me go to HR, and then HR did pull in, 2 other people, and the 3 of them hit me after the doctor. So there was a kind of coordinated, and weirdly, my mental picture of that is always a rugby kind of, one person starts tackling you, and everybody else has to kind of pile on to just pull you to the floor and make you stop and be like, will you just stop? But I mean, I'm so incredibly grateful that they did.
Of course,
because it would have had to come to a head. It was increasingly coming to a head. And I actually stopped driving for a couple of months because my anxiety was at such a level that I wasn't kind of consciously present. And I had a couple of times where I would not, I'd be driving down the motorway and I'd forget where I was, or, just wouldn't, just
brain fog. You just lose it.
Would have done a 2-hour drive and not remember any of it. So that, I don't know how much longer I could have done that without it being dangerous or frankly, just ending up in a sopping heap somewhere in an office and them having to do something about it. And, the day that I was signed off, I was still on project site. I, cried my way in, spoke to my career advisor. He'd been told by HR, and he was like, I think we need to get you back here, finish off your day, come back. We'll deal with it then. And so I'd kind of pulled myself together. I went and ran a workshop for 25 people, none of whom spotted a single thing wrong. Went and told my project leader at the end of the day that I had to step away. And he said, he said something really mild, like, I don't think you should have gone about it like that, or something like that. At which point I burst into tears I literally just went from, I'm holding this together to, and he was like, oh my God.
Oh.
and for the first time, I think he realized just what had been kind of under the surface. And then I never went back to that project site. And as far as the team was concerned, I just, I was there 1 minute and operating as normal and gone the next, and they never knew why. And it's only sort of years later that I met up with some of them again and explained exactly what had happened.
That's interesting.
So it's taught me a lot of things. The main one is just how good people can be at masking, but also how much effort that masking will cost you. Because it was, I was kind of keeping my performance up there, but it was taking so much more effort. Everything that I had was getting poured into maintaining that facade that everything was okay.
It's quite lonely as well, isn't it? It's kind of lonely being behind those masks where no one can really see what the real you.
Yeah, and even my I guess fiance at the time didn't really, I think, know or be allowed to see it. And then he was hugely helpful and supportive once it all came out. But yeah, I was just very good at hiding it. But as I sort of went through that, and it is absolutely one of the worst experiences of my life, I kind of promised myself that it would make me better, that it would make me stronger, it would make me a better manager, a better friend, that I would learn from it. That's kind of what kept me going when I had that, when the anxiety was really acute and the depression had kind of hit, that there was going to be something positive coming out of this. And that's kind of what led me, when I was, back and feeling stronger, to start sharing my story. And because I knew that I wouldn't be the only one. And that's the weird thing. All of these people, when it happened, came out of the woodwork and were like, yeah, this has happened to me. And I was like,
yeah,
hang on. I thought I was the only one.
Where were you?
I thought I was literally the only one who couldn't cope with this, and that it was something defective in me, and I was weak and pathetic, and I wasn't the person that everybody
letting
thought
people
I
down.
was, and I was letting people down. And then I realised that actually I wasn't the only one, and this happened a lot. And then just nobody was talking about it. I was like, who else is out there who's feeling the way I was feeling and not knowing that? So I was like, no, I'm gonna start sharing, and that's why I can kind of continue to do that, because every single time I have, somebody has said, I thought I was alone, and now I'm not. And I think that's such an important thing, and that's why we do so much story sharing at Avanade, is because we want those experiences out there, because there's so many varied experiences and so many people who feel alone, and they aren't alone. It's just that we're not talking. So let's just talk more.
Oh, beautiful. I feel like we could close there. Like, that's the message. But of course, I still want to go into other places. But so when it comes to working in the space of well-being, mental health, and of course you work globally, it's kind of it's really simple, but not necessarily easy, right? So the simple bit is, connection. We know, right? And science can back this up now. Connection, a feeling of belonging, being able to reach out to 1 or 2, 5 people, that's it, right? Can just help us realize we're not alone, alleviate that suffering, and perhaps get us the help we need, right? Simple. But of course, we've got all of our personal conditioning, which you kind of mapped out there for you, which was like, wear the mask, show no weakness, like, don't let people down. And then we've got the context culturally, and whether it's Avanade or another business, right? We have to work hard. We want to get a salary. There's all these other concepts, right, that go on within a workplace. So let's think globally for a second. Where do you even start when it comes to all the cultural nuance? And it's a complex task with that many people.
It is. And you've just got to start small and keep expanding. I mean, I don't think we've got it cracked yet. That I have to keep reminding myself it's a journey. I'm one of those people who's always kind of looking at it and going, oh, I wish I'd achieved more. And I get to the end of the year and I look back and I think about all the stuff that I haven't done that I wanted to do and think, oh, damn it.
Yeah.
because I am aware that there's a person on the end of every single one of those. But, again, you have to remind yourself that you can't change the world overnight, and you've got to kind of, if you can change it for one or two people, then it is a big difference for them. So we started kind of almost at a global level and putting stuff out there for everybody and inviting them to engage with it. But we are very conscious that, for example, even simple things like the way that you engage in, say, Asian countries or even European countries versus American countries, and just in terms of energy levels, even if you're doing it in English, and even if you're doing it, the same topic, that kind of really high energy delivery that you might get for the US, just, I think if I sit on a webinar and I'm finding that like energy level a bit much and I think sometimes it can come across as a bit, unauthentic to a Brit viewing that kind
informative
of, woo!
Awesome.
that type of energy. If I'm feeling that, how is somebody in, Singapore or Malaysia or Japan interpreting that? Because they're even more kind of conservative in kind of the way that they communicate. And so even simple things like, because you deliver some of our we'll deliver the same content and we'll have one version that might be much, much slower, lower energy levels and, simpler language for our sort of growth markets audience. And then we'll have another version that's much more high energy for our American audience. So even small tweaks like that, but we are now really quite kind of leaning into our area breakouts. So I've now joined our inclusion and diversity team, and we are merging our inclusion, diversity and wellbeing strategies. So,
well done. I'm so excited about
our
this.
area leads are now area leads for inclusion, diversity and wellbeing. So that's going to enable us to be much more targeted in making sure that we're bringing the right interventions to the right places. Because, I mean, not all of our regions have the same challenges in the first place. So we need to be able to sort of adapt to that. But we also need to be able to be much more culturally nuanced in what we're delivering. And in fact, we do have a training course that we designed last year, which is about leading for wellbeing and inclusion. And it's because we acknowledge that, and it's not just Avanade, it's, companies in general, we've been selecting our leaders for the last 20 years, on strategic vision and, their ability to negotiate and be adaptable and all of these other traits. And that, those are the things that we've been teaching them how to do. But we've not been selecting for empathy or authenticity, and we've not been training them how
or people skills often.
Exactly. Yeah. So now we're saying, I think, and I do think COVID had a big shift. All of a sudden, people's perception of what a leader should do and what they should be responsible for has changed. And it's like, well, how are they set up for that? Because some of them are naturally very good at it, but others maybe don't have those skills. And, empathy is a learned skill. So what are we doing to teach it? So we've got this new course that's, helping those people, and we have adapted that. It's delivered in multiple languages. But when we translated it, we didn't just translate it. We tweaked it for those regions as well, to make sure that it landed. And, there's different examples of inclusion and exclusion or well-being scenarios or whatever in there to make it relevant to those people so that they can really engage with it and learn from it.
Well, engagement is something as well. And I want to just, for our audience who aren't maybe in our world, just highlight why I got excited when you said you're kind of putting your well-being and inclusion diversity strategies together. And it's because, and you know this, so many companies work in silos, right? So they've got departments that run those separate kind of things, well-being, mental health. Perhaps there's even culture and engagement somewhere else, diversity and inclusion, right? And while that's fine because there is nuance, there's then this challenge of engagement, right? And you kind of think, you're all on the same side, technically, right? But often internally, there might be vying for budgets. There might be, just kind of staying in your silo, which is what that word sort of describes, right? And then the user on the other end, right, who gets now 10 emails a week about these initiatives and all the different things, right? And then can only attend one, so has to pick, or, there's almost this overwhelm, this kind of initiative overwhelm. And then we're all kind of going, why is engagement lower? Why aren't people showing up, right? And so a first step that so many people are not yet doing is combining some of these, or making your comms plan at least combined, right? So that there feels like there's some kind of coordination, perhaps, to not overwhelm the poor user on the other end. But do you have any other thoughts just on the engagement element? Because everybody's different. 100% engagement is not necessarily the gold standard, right? So what does good look like? How do we think about this?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've been on my soapbox a little bit over the last year because, belonging is actually part of our construct of well-being. So we have 4 pillars of well-being. Belonging is one of those elements.
Beautiful.
It sits under that kind of heart element, because we've got heart, mind, body, and soul. And so, I've been partnering with I&D for a long time, and it just, when we made my role in wellbeing permanent, it made sense to bring it together with that. And you're looking at, do you set up a structure for wellbeing? And then you think, well, what would that look like? Well, you spend half your time interfacing with your counterparts in I&D anyway. So actually, does it just make more sense to expand I&D to wellbeing and use that already established, set up to actually deliver your wellbeing agenda? And that's kind of the conclusion we came to, was that it was a much more sensible thing.
Well, it's your internal brand, right? Keeping that consistent is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and we've got one set of plans. Event planning for the year happens all together, all sort of feeding into the same thing that works with our internal comms. I also sit on the Citizenship Council. Okay. So because for me, responsible business has to have that citizenship, the sustainability, well-being, and I&D all kind of comes under the same umbrella, and there's so many different touch points within that. So, working, I think, across that, and we're talking about, we used to have volunteer impact awards. We've got our internal I&D awards, which this year are I&D and wellbeing awards. But now we're talking about, how do we make those human impact awards? Can we bring that together to be one thing and really, consolidate down and make it, I think, do less, but with higher engagement, rather than, lots of little things with a little bit of engagement. I don't think necessarily works. I think you can be smarter about how you go about it and push those engagement levels up by picking the right things and making sure that they're really meaningful, and then really letting people lean into them.
And if we just think high level for a moment, I know there's loads of detail in this, but you guys for some time have had a real strategic approach around this. What are some of the 2 or 3 key elements that you think a useful wellbeing strategy should include?
I mean, and this was an easy bit for me, but I know that it isn't for a lot of organisations.
Right.
And I know when I speak to other organisations just how lucky I am on this one, and that is having the right sponsorship. So from our CEO through to our Chief People Officer, through to our Chief Inclusion Officer, who I report into, everybody is really supportive of this agenda. I've got an executive sponsor who sits on our executive committee as well. It is absolutely, supported and endorsed at the highest levels. And, I never had that pushback when I sat down, wrote a wellbeing strategy, got all the research, put it together and said, right, this is what I want to do. And this is why it is a performance driver for our business. And we need to make it a priority. They didn't say, no, that's an awful idea. My chief people officer said, excellent, let's make this happen. That's the attitude I got. Yeah. And that has been so important to be able to move forward. So getting that leadership, and I know you've done a lot of talking about how you actually go about getting that, but getting that sponsorship is so important. And then, leadership generally as a topic, because behaviors cascade. So what you see your leaders doing, what you see people getting rewarded for, really super important. So making sure that our leaders know how to lead for wellbeing. And I think a lot of the time you can have people who are empathetic and do want to help, but they don't know how. We've not taught them how to do that in a workplace. Most people have comforted a friend who's got divorced or had a bereavement or whatever. We've done that in our personal lives, but we're not sure of what the boundaries are when we bring it into the workplace. So leadership's a really kind of key piece for us. And then there's a really big structural element to this for me. How do we do business? How do we go about how we work? It's not just about policies and processes come into it, but, how do we set ourselves up for success and make sure we're not damaging our people in the first place? That I think it needs to come into some wellbeing policies some wellbeing strategies a lot more.
Agreed.
Sometimes I see it, the focus is on benefits, or it's on, everyone's going, I've got this new app, or, if nobody ever presented a wellbeing app to me again, I don't think I'd lose any sleep. Honestly,
you probably have more time in your day to invest in yourself anyway.
Those emails don't necessarily get as much attention as the vendors might hope. But, fundamentally, they're kind of leaning into this idea that it's our people that are the problem and we need to fix them, and therefore we'll give them some way of supporting, rather than considering maybe that it's the workplace environment that drives a lot of this, and actually we need to fix the root cause. So
beautiful. Yeah. And the world of work is changing, as we know. We've got technology, AI, like that's all the buzz as far as how the world of work is going to change, regardless of whether we want to or not, and how the people element will be restructured in a variety of ways. How do you feel about the future of work if we just think of like what people are saying is coming? Personally.
As somebody who was using ChatGPT to write a load of stuff yesterday, some of it, I think there is potential to massively remove some of the drudge of work. But doing it in an ethical way, I think, is going to be really important. And certainly, because that's one of the things we do with one of the world's largest, Microsoft partners. We will be absolutely at the forefront of helping implement AI in other people's businesses. So making sure that we've got a really strong foundation for, around the ethics and frameworks that we need to put around AI is really important. But in terms of, I'm thinking, how's this going to impact people's well-being? And what's that going to do? And, and I don't have a good answer for that yet. It's it needs smarter than people than me to think kind of that far ahead. I think certainly in terms of it being a disruptor, I think it's causing a lot of people quite a lot of uncertainty in, what is going to get removed, what's that going to mean in terms of the larger workforces. But when I think about, will we? I have seen a CBT-enabled chatbot already that uses AI to respond to you. So will we see, EAPs, for example, employee sort of counselors,
Assistance programs, yeah.
those types of things. Will we see that using AI and you being able to go and get, responses from that, and what's the risks around that? But then some people, and I'm thinking, I couldn't tell anybody the situation I was in, or I didn't feel I could. Would I have been more comfortable seeking advice maybe from something that I knew was inanimate and didn't have a judgment to make? Maybe it could actually help people engage with services that at the moment they're too scared to use.
Especially that first tier and that triaging element, right? So when you call the EAP and you reach a helpline and they just ask you a load of questions, but yet tell you it's anonymous, it's very disconcerting for people, right? So I was recently at a roundtable discussing empathy and AI and sort of what that kind of connection was and what people sort of need. So I can see that kind of accessibility element for people would be great. But and I think the people who are going to thrive as ever, evolution, right, are those of us who are resilient, can adapt and can ride with change and adapt what we know as well. So continue to learn and develop our brain. It's those of us who hold on tight and are like, don't change, maybe it won't if I don't look, that kind of end up suffering, right? Because we don't evolve our skills or move forward in different ways. But at the same time, what have we seen through pandemic times for our younger generation? I've got 2 teenagers, right? In using, all the social media and all the, you go on a train and everyone's like that, right? Whether it's reading, whether it's whatever they're doing. And then the loneliness statistics are up, the disconnection. And we, in our jobs, right, we know that that's the fundamental issue that is affecting us. Because if we can't talk, right, and connect and have hard conversations, well-being is also about hard conversations, right? Misunderstandings, assumptions, all this stuff, polarization. And then we see all this kind of, crises happening, right? So I can certainly see that if we don't learn to have difficult conversations and be able to connect and evolve together, that's where I see the risk more than just the technology, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think you're right that because you are kind of connecting with something that's inanimate and it's letting you, maybe if it's an uncomfortable situation or an uncomfortable conversation, you don't force yourself to do it by speaking to a real person. You do it through going into a chat bot and getting an answer from that. And I'm thinking now, what would have happened today if I'd asked for that sabbatical policy? Because I would have gone into an AI chatbot and said, I need the sabbatical policy, and it would have given me the sabbatical policy. And nobody would have known. Nobody knows. So what human touch points are we losing? And so I think how we keep the humanity in some of those processes is going to be really important. And how we keep our creativity around things. Because I think that's the bit that AI can't do for us. It can't create. It can't care. It can pretend to care, but it doesn't really, and we know it. So, those I think are going to be things we really have to lean into as we go through this journey.
And the thing I'm seeing so often with our kids as well, and anyone who is isolated, is that many people are out of practice now in simple socialization, right? Oh, okay, we can talk about the football scores and what's on in the news and what's tough out there, right? That's our little trauma connecting point. But it's harder, I think, for people to go, hey, I misunderstood that. Can I just check something? Or how are you really? I noticed this thing, I might be wrong, but I just wanted to find out, and just maybe we can grab coffee. I feel like people are out of practice. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, it's not something that I've seen particularly. I know that other people have talked about it a little bit, but it's not something I've kind of got first-hand experience of. What I find is that a lot of people are less willing to lean in, maybe. So it's not like the skills have gone, but it's more I mean, I was in the office this week for the first time in, several months. I work in a global role. It's 4-hour round trip for me to be in the office. Why would I go to London to speak to somebody in Singapore? I mean, she's just
Yeah.
And it was really lovely being there. But I was talking to other people, and they're like, "Yeah, I don't get in very often either." And it's because we've kind of got used to not having that burden of the commute or the cost of the commute, or maybe people have managed to find some new balance in their home lives that they didn't have before, and now that they don't want to lean back out of their home lives. They've got used to putting their kids to bed or having dinner with their spouse, or in my case, going and playing squash and whatever else I do of an evening, and we don't want to give that up. So there's a reticence, but I think there's still certainly it wasn't something that I picked up this week when we were together, that anybody was less good at it than they had been a couple of years ago. There was almost like I would say the opposite, almost like a real enthusiasm to make the most of it, because it was rare and precious, and therefore all that more exciting to be together.
To tackle. Yeah, beautiful. I think it's industry dependent. So I think I'm seeing different industries who are more in that survival mode still, who are finding less time for those connections even when they're on offer. But certainly there's that need, I think a desperate need for many of us.
I think you're right that there's a reduction in connection. So it was like before COVID, we connected in person, and that's what we did. During COVID, we were really purposeful about connecting online. And then we kind of got to this point now where we're kind of back to in person, but we're not really. We're kind of half and half. And we've lost a lot of the personal connection, but we've stopped being purposeful about how we connect in
that kind of conscious attention
so that conscious attention is gone, and I think that's left us in a worse place than we have been for the last few years, even during COVID, because at least then it was we were all in a similar situation, and we were all being very purposeful and making sure that we lent into that. And now we're in this kind of neither fish nor fowl kind of,
it should just be happening automatically.
We're kind of assuming that it will be automatic like it was because we've got some face-to-face interaction, but actually it isn't. And I think for me, because I live still very much in the remote world, I'm still very purposeful about that. So we still have a bi-weekly cuppa catch-up with some of my colleagues who aren't people I work with on a regular basis, but it's just an excuse to sit there and talk to other people. That's a really good thing. But I think for a lot of people that isn't there.
They've lost it.
We've lost it. And I think it's really easy to do. But the one thing I've never found a good virtual solution for is that kind of chance meeting thing. So the fact that
the spontaneity.
So even though I've been quite good at kind of catching up with my existing network, that network expansion is there's less opportunity there in a virtual world than there is when you can be face to face. You don't bump into somebody making a cup of coffee, or you're not chatting to somebody that you already know when somebody you don't know walks up and they introduce you. You'll be on the phone, you'll be on a Teams call with one person, then you'll be on a Teams call with a different person. They'll say, I've got to go because I've got so-and-so ringing. They won't introduce you as part of that.
No, that's true. Those organic introductions. Now, Emily, I know I could talk to you all day. I feel like we could write the entire world if we just stayed on for 8 hours. But I want to ask you one final question, because we haven't got that much time. In fact, two, because I might sneak it in. But one question is, and I ask this to all guests on the show, what do you think is the most radical change you think we need when it comes to well-being and the focus on mental health we see in the world today? Big question. It could be anything, big or small. What do you reckon?
So this is the only question you gave me beforehand.
Yeah.
So I have been having a think about this, and I thought, do I take this from a personal perspective or a societal perspective or an organizational perspective? And I'm a wellbeing lead. That's my job. It's so I'm going to come at this from an organizational perspective. And I've touched on this briefly a few minutes ago, but let's lean into it, properly. And that is this. I am a big fan of something called the positive opposite assumption. It's a brilliant coaching technique that I got taught a few years back, and it's really useful. And it's basically you take, you examine an assumption you're making, you look at it and you go, okay, is it an assumption? If it's an assumption, is there a more positive assumption that may be, different than that I can make instead? So that's the coaching technique. And what I would like us to do is take the negative opposite assumption in this particular case. So the particular assumption that I'm talking about is that as companies, I think we also often assume that when somebody's having mental health issues or, wellbeing issues, that the problem is the employee or it's external. It's the employee or, the situation they're in, the environment around them, or, it's external circumstances, it's what's going on in the world. Or even, if it is something internal to our organization, it's one person, it's just that particular leader or, that particular employee that maybe has got a clash with the employee that's having the issues. And that, I think, leads us to a set of interventions by their very nature that focus on employees and kind of fixing employees.
Sort them out.
Yeah. And that's why you've got so many wellbeing apps, because if your assumption is that it's the people that are, broken in inverted commas in some way, shape or form, then that's what you're trying to fix. And I would like us to make the opposite assumption. We have seen so much research from, like people like the wonderful McKinsey Health Institute talking about how toxic workplace environment are by far and away the biggest drivers of workplace burnout. And yet we're still making this assumption that it's something to do with the individual and it's not something systemic about our businesses. And I don't mean Avanade, I mean businesses in general, the way that the whole workplace goes about treating our employees. So I'm wondering what would happen if we made the negative opposite assumption that we are at fault. That if there's a problem with one of our employees, the first place we should look is what is the environment, what is the culture, what is the structure we're putting around those employees that have caused us to end up in that place. And then I think, what are the different thoughts, the different behaviors and the different outcomes we would drive if we took that assumption? Because you wouldn't be looking for things that changed the individual or supported the individual. You'd be thinking, well, how do I change what we're doing here? If I make the assumption that we are the ones causing the damage, what would that lead me to do? So, for me this year, that's got me thinking, well, which wellbeing leads of our clients do I need to sit down with? How do I get together with, because we've got clients I know have wellbeing leads. So they're looking at wellbeing internally. We're looking at wellbeing internally. How do we get together to say, how do we, what frameworks or what setups can we put in place for our joint product teams to make sure that they are delivering in a healthy way? How do we do that? What would that look like if we could get that right for our people? Yeah, there's still going to be personal things that go on and we're still going to need to support that. But how could we transform people's well-being if we took away some of those fundamental stresses, which is toxic workplace behaviors? And I think that for me could, revolutionize where we think we should spend our time as wellbeing professionals.
Beautiful. Emily, thank you so much for your time. I think there's a lot of food for thought there. I mean, we can just go into meeting culture. We can go into leadership. The whole future of work needs to evolve, and it isn't just about fixing an individual. Beautiful. Emily, if people want to get in touch with you or connect with you to further the conversation, where can they go?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm connected with you. I'm commenting on your stuff quite a lot. I think I'm fairly easy to find under Avanade, and and my LinkedIn profile. So yeah, they can find me there.
Perfect. Yeah. We'll put your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time and spending, giving us your wisdom and advice. And now I'm always thinking of you as an astrophysicist, though, even though you're a well-being lead. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Fetcher.